Introduction: The Enigma of Jeffrey Dahmer. Good evening, and welcome once more to our ongoing exploration into the darker corners of human history. Tonight, we turn our attention to a name that has become synonymous with horror and unspeakable acts. Jeffrey Dahmer, once an unassuming figure in the Midwestern United States, now remembered as one of the most notorious serial killers of the 20th century. But who was Jeffrey Dahmer, truly? Much has been said and written about Dahmer. The media painted him as the Milwaukee Monster, a man whose crimes were so unimaginable that they shook an entire nation to its core. Cannibal, murderer, necrophile. These words are forever linked to his name. But beyond these labels lies a troubling question. How does someone like Dahmer come to be? Was he born a monster, or was he made one by circumstances beyond his control? In this episode, we will not merely recount the grisly details of his crimes, though in time we will delve into those as well. No, our aim tonight is to understand the human being behind the headlines, to peer into the mind of a man whose life seemed a collision of inner demons and unspeakable actions. This is not an exercise in forgiveness, nor is it an attempt to excuse his behavior. Rather, it is a scholarly examination of how the threads of biology, psychology, and environment may have woven together to create a figure like Jeffrey Dahmer. We will begin by examining the early life of Dahmer, looking for clues in his childhood that might foreshadow the dark path he would ultimately take. From there, we will trace the development of his disturbing obsessions, his methods, and the escalation of his crimes. We will consider his capture, his trial, and how the world reacted to his confessions. Finally, we will reflect on the legacy he has left behind. A legacy that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the fragility of the human mind. Jeffrey Dahmer is more than a symbol of evil. He is a reminder of how thin the line can be between the ordinary and the monstrous. And while we cannot fully comprehend the mind of a killer, we can strive to understand the forces that may drive one to such lengths. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Early Years. Roots of Isolation. Every story begins somewhere, and for Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, it began in the unassuming suburbs of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Born on May 21, 1960, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, Jeffrey's early life appeared outwardly typical, a normal childhood in a middle-aged American home. But as is often the case, appearances can be deceiving. From the start, there were signs of trouble. Jeffrey's father, Lionel, was a research chemist often absorbed in his work. His mother, Joyce, struggled with her own mental health, battling anxiety and bouts of depression. Their marriage was fraught with conflict, a constant storm of arguments and emotional distance. In this environment, young Jeffrey grew up withdrawn and emotionally neglected, a quiet boy who would soon drift into an inner world of isolation. It is said that Jeffrey was a shy child, often introverted and lacking the typical social connections that many of his peers formed so easily. He was not the kind of boy who caused trouble at school, nor did he draw much attention to himself. Instead, he remained in the shadows, unnoticed. But behind this quiet exterior lay the beginnings of something much darker. As a child, Jeffrey exhibited an unusual fascination with the macabre. While most children his age were content playing outdoors or engaging in sports, Jeffrey found solace in something altogether different: dead animals. He began collecting roadkill, fascinated by the process of decomposition. He would dissect the animals he found, curious about what lay beneath the surface, a fascination that would later escalate in the most horrific ways. It is at this point that we must ask ourselves, what drives a young boy to such interests? Was it merely a scientific curiosity, inherited from his own father's work as a chemist, or was there something far more troubling at play? an early manifestation of darkness that would later consume him. Psychologists have long debated whether Dahmer's fascination with death and decay was a product of nature or nurture. Could his emotionally distant upbringing have driven him to seek control over something, anything, in a world where he felt powerless? Or was this morbid curiosity always within him, waiting to be unleashed? Whatever the case, it was clear that from a young age, Jeffrey Dahmer was beginning to walk a path few could understand. During his adolescence, Dahmer's isolation deepened. His classmates recall him as an outsider, a boy who kept to himself and rarely spoke. When he did engage with others, it was often through dark humor or bizarre pranks, another clue, perhaps, of the disordered thoughts swirling within his mind. By the time he reached his teenage years, Dahmer had begun drinking heavily, even during school hours, numbing himself to the growing disconnection he felt from the world around him. This period of Dahmer's life is critical in understanding his descent into the unimaginable. The isolation, the emotional detachment, and the fascination with death were all taking root, yet no one noticed, no one intervened. His family life continued to deteriorate, with his parents eventually divorcing when he was 18, and as the world moved on, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, Dahmer took his first fateful step into the darkness. In 1978, shortly after his parents' divorce, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. The victim was 18-year-old Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker who would unknowingly become the first in a long line of young men to fall victim to Dahmer's insatiable need for control and possession. But, for now, we pause. For the roots of isolation have been planted, and soon they will bear their terrible fruit. In our next chapter, we will follow Dahmer's journey as he begins to transform from a withdrawn young man into a predator, capable of the unthinkable. But remember, as we move forward, there were signs, yes, but the human mind is a complex labyrinth, and once lost within it, finding the way out becomes nearly impossible. Chapter 2: A Descent into Darkness. First Kill and Escalation. By the time Jeffrey Dahmer turned 18, his life had already been marked by isolation and emotional distance. His parents' turbulent marriage and eventual divorce had left him feeling abandoned and alone. It was during this fragile period that Dahmer took a step that would change the course of his life forever. A step from which there would be no return. Stephen Hicks was a young man, full of life and trust, making his way home after a day out with friends. When Dahmer offered him a ride, it seemed like a harmless gesture. Two young men, not so different in age, sharing a ride and a conversation. But for Dahmer, this encounter was about more than companionship. Dahmer invited Hicks back to his house for a few drinks. As the evening progressed, Dahmer became increasingly anxious about Hicks leaving. In his mind, this would be another loss, another person walking away from him just like his parents had. Desperate to prevent this, Dahmer made a decision that would mark the beginning of a dark chapter in his life. After taking Hicks' life, Dahmer would be left with a terrible realization. He had crossed a line, but instead of feeling regret, he found himself overwhelmed by a need to control the situation. He acted not out of anger, but from a deep-seated fear of being alone. In the aftermath, he went to great lengths to cover up what he had done, concealing the evidence. For many years after this, Dahmer lived in relative quiet. He enrolled at Ohio State University, though his time there was brief and marked by his struggles with alcohol. He later enlisted in the U.S. Army, serving as a medical specialist. However, his drinking habits and personal issues continued to spiral, leading to his discharge in 1981. Dahmer spent the next several years living with his grandmother, trying to blend in with those around him. But despite the normalcy of his outward life, the thoughts and urges that had driven him to act once before never truly left him. He frequented social spaces, but his goal was not connection. It was control. In 1987, almost 9 years after his first crime, those same urges resurfaced with greater intensity. This time, Dahmer met Stephen Twomey, a young man he encountered at a bar. What happened next, according to Dahmer, was not planned. Dahmer later claimed that he had no recollection of taking Twomey's life, only that he woke up the next morning to find that he had crossed that terrible line once again. With Stephen Twomey, Dahmer's need for control grew more extreme. He had now taken 2 lives, and with each one, his ability to disconnect from his actions seemed to grow. From this point forward, Dahmer's behavior would become more calculated, as his attempts to exert control over others began to follow a chilling pattern. Dahmer's descent into darkness was not a sudden one. It was a slow, deliberate path that was shaped by his fear of abandonment and his need for control. Over the next few years, his actions would escalate, leading him further down a road from which there was no turning back. But it's important to remember, as we continue to explore his story, that each of his victims was a person, a life cut tragically short. In our next chapter, we will delve deeper into the methods Dahmer used to manipulate and control those around him. But for now, let us reflect on how easily a life can be derailed when fear and isolation take hold, and the terrible consequences that can follow when no one intervenes. Chapter 3: The Unthinkable: Dahmer's Methods and Motives. Between 1987 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's actions escalated, taking him further down a path that combined manipulation, control, and a deeply troubling need for possession. During these years, Dahmer's crimes grew more methodical and calculated. He had developed patterns, honing his ability to deceive and dominate those he encountered. But to understand these actions, we must first understand the deep-rooted psychological needs that drove him. Dahmer had become skilled at blending in, appearing like everyone else in the city. He would visit bars and social spaces, places where he could meet people who were often vulnerable or marginalized. For many, these places represented safety or community. But for Dahmer, they were opportunities. He would approach young men, often offering them money for photographs or inviting them back to his apartment for drinks. At first glance, there was nothing alarming about him. He was quiet, polite, even unassuming. Once inside his apartment, Dahmer's approach shifted. His need for control was profound, driven by a deep fear of being abandoned. He didn't want his guests to leave, and to ensure this, he would offer them drinks that had been drugged. This was his way of making sure they remained under his control. His actions were not motivated by anger or hatred, but by a troubling desire to keep these individuals with him, to prevent them from leaving. For Dahmer, it was not just about the act of violence itself. His actions were rooted in a need for domination. He wanted to possess these people completely, even after they could no longer leave. This need stemmed from a profound fear of loneliness, and it drove his every action during these years. It's important to understand that for Dahmer, the idea of control was about more than just physical dominance. It was about making sure that no one could ever abandon him. As the years went on, Dahmer's actions became more calculated, more controlled. He created routines and patterns, finding ways to ensure that no one would know what was happening behind the closed doors of his apartment. The secrecy and isolation of his life allowed him to continue his behavior for years without being caught. At the heart of Dahmer's story is a profound sense of loneliness and isolation. He was a man who could not bear the thought of being left alone, and his way of dealing with that fear became increasingly destructive. He wanted control, not out of a desire to hurt others, but because he believed it was the only way to prevent them from leaving him. His behavior may be difficult to comprehend, but it reflects a deeply disturbed psyche, one that was shaped by years of emotional neglect and disconnection. Dahmer's methods, though disturbing, were not driven by rage or aggression. They were rooted in a need for connection, a tragic, broken need that led him down a path of destruction. His story reminds us that loneliness, when combined with unchecked psychological issues, can manifest in ways that are both harmful to the individual and devastating to those around them. In our next chapter, we will explore the events that ultimately led to Dahmer's capture. But for now, let us reflect on the importance of recognizing the signs of isolation and emotional distress in those around us. In Dahmer's case, his need for control led to unspeakable actions, but it also serves as a reminder that when left unaddressed, psychological pain can manifest in devastating ways. Chapter 4: Inside the Mind: Psychological Breakdown. As we have already seen, Jeffrey Dahmer was not driven by anger or revenge, but rather by a deep-seated need for control, possession, and companionship. However, to truly understand the depths of his depravity, we must venture into the mind of a man who, over time, became utterly consumed by his own fractured desires. What led Dahmer to commit such heinous acts? Was it the result of a broken mind, twisted by years of isolation and neglect? Or were there darker forces at play, something more primal and instinctive? Throughout his trial and subsequent interviews, experts sought to understand whether Jeffrey Dahmer was mentally ill, and if so, to what extent. The defense argued that he was suffering from a variety of psychological disorders, including borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. But the prosecution countered that while Dahmer was certainly disturbed, he was also fully aware of the nature and consequences of his actions, and therefore legally sane. The question of Dahmer's sanity lies at the heart of understanding his crimes. Was he a man completely detached from reality, unable to control his impulses? Or was he a manipulative predator, fully conscious of his actions, yet driven by an overwhelming compulsion to kill? Dahmer himself provided chilling insights into his own mind. In interviews, he spoke candidly about his thoughts and feelings during the murders, often describing them with a cold detachment that would unnerve even seasoned investigators. He admitted that his desire for control over his victims extended beyond life and death. He wanted them to be with him forever, to be part of him. This obsession with possession, both physical and emotional, became the driving force behind his crimes. Dahmer also revealed that he had attempted to create what he called living zombies, victims who were alive but rendered completely submissive, unable to leave him. He would drill holes into their skulls and inject acid or boiling water into their brains, hoping to erase their will while keeping them alive. These grotesque experiments, while ultimately unsuccessful, provide a glimpse into the terrifying extent of Dahmer's need for control. This attempt to create living, breathing victims who were entirely subservient is perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of Dahmer's psychology. It speaks to a complete breakdown of moral boundaries, where human life became nothing more than a tool for his own gratification. The fact that he could perform such gruesome acts without hesitation raises important questions about his mental state. Was this simply the result of a compulsion he could not resist, or was there a deeper, more calculated force at work? To explore this further, we must consider Dahmer's upbringing and formative years, his isolation as a child, his growing obsession with death, and his inability to form lasting emotional connections all contributed to his detachment from reality. Over time, these factors seem to merge into a single overpowering desire to possess, control, and dominate others in a way that no one could resist. In many ways, Dahmer's crimes were not simply about killing. They were about erasing the autonomy of others, reducing them to objects he could manipulate and preserve. Many experts have speculated that Dahmer's compulsion was rooted in a profound sense of abandonment. As a child, he was emotionally neglected by his parents, and as an adult, he struggled to find his place in the world. His desire to prevent anyone from leaving him, whether through death, manipulation, or even consumption, was perhaps a twisted way of coping with his own feelings of rejection. Apparently, he can't just cry and eat ice cream like the rest of us. In one of his more chilling admissions, Dahmer told investigators, "I didn't want them to leave. That was the whole idea. I didn't want them to leave." This simple statement alone encapsulates so much of his pathology, a desperate, all-consuming fear of being left alone, coupled with a need for complete control over those he lured into his life. But the question remains, was Dahmer truly insane? The legal definition of insanity requires that an individual be unable to understand the nature or wrongfulness of their actions. In Dahmer's case, the court found that while he was clearly disturbed, no shit, he was fully aware of what he was doing. He took steps to conceal his crimes. He understood that his actions were illegal, and he showed remorse in later interviews, factors that led to his conviction as a legally sane individual. Nevertheless, the debate over Dahmer's mental state continues to this day. Some argue that his crimes were the result of deep psychological trauma, combined with an inability to connect with others in a meaningful way. Others believe Dahmer was fully conscious of his actions, a cold-blooded killer who chose to act on his darkest desires. In the end, Dahmer's mind remains an enigma. He was not the typical serial killer, driven by rage or revenge. His motives were more complex, more tragic in some ways, and more terrifying in others. He sought to possess and control, not out of hatred, but out of a deep-seated need to fill the void within himself. And yet, despite all the theories, diagnoses, and analyses, the truth of Dahmer's psychological state may never be fully understood. In our next chapter, we will examine the capture of Jeffrey Dahmer, the moment when his reign of terror finally came to an end. But as we move forward, let us not forget the complexity of the human mind, and the dangerous paths it can lead us down when left unchecked. Chapter 5. The Capture. A Predator Unmasked. By July 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer had managed to evade capture for nearly 4 years. His actions had gone unnoticed, and his crimes continued behind closed doors. But on the night of July 22, 1991, everything changed. A single act of bravery would bring an end to his long-held secrets and unmask the truth behind his horrifying actions. Tracy Edwards was one of the many individuals Dahmer lured back to his apartment that summer. Edwards had been invited over under the pretense of having drinks and taking photographs. But as the night wore on, Edwards realized something was very wrong. Dahmer's behavior had become erratic, and soon, Edwards found himself in a situation where he felt his life was in danger. With quick thinking and a lot of courage, Edwards seized an opportunity to escape. In a moment of distraction, Edwards managed to break free and ran out of the apartment, making his way to the streets where he flagged down 2 police officers. It was this act of bravery that set the wheels of justice in motion. When officers arrived at Dahmer's apartment, what they found would shock not only the city of Milwaukee but the entire world. At first, the apartment seemed like any other small, cluttered space in the city, but soon, the officers discovered something that left no doubt about what had been happening behind these closed doors. They found photographs and other items that confirmed Edwards' worst fears. Dahmer had been hiding more than just secrets. With this evidence in hand, the police arrested Jeffrey Dahmer that night. He didn't resist. In fact, he seemed almost resigned to his fate. What followed was an investigation that revealed the full extent of Dahmer's actions. Actions that had remained hidden for so long, right in the middle of a busy city. News of Dahmer's arrest spread quickly, and soon, the world learned about the horrors that had taken place in his small apartment. The discovery shocked not only Milwaukee but the entire country. How had someone like Jeffrey Dahmer been able to carry out these acts without anyone noticing? How had he managed to remain undetected for so long? These were questions that would haunt the community for years to come. For the families of Dahmer's victims, his arrest was a moment of mixed emotions. On one hand, it brought an end to the uncertainty surrounding their loved ones' disappearances. On the other hand, the horrific truth of what had happened was almost too much to bear. For them, this was not just the end of Dahmer's freedom, it was the beginning of a long process of healing and seeking justice. The capture of Jeffrey Dahmer was not the result of an elaborate police investigation or a long-standing manhunt. It was the courage of one man, Tracy Edwards, that ultimately brought an end to Dahmer's reign of terror. In the end, it was a single act of bravery that unmasked one of the most infamous criminals in modern history. As we move forward in this story, we'll examine how the justice system responded to Dahmer's crimes, and how his trial brought the full weight of his actions to the public eye. But for now, let us remember that even in the face of unimaginable horror, the courage of one individual can make all the difference. Chapter 6. The Trial, Justice and Insanity. On January 30th, 1992, the trial of Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer began. It was a moment that the nation had anticipated with equal parts horror and curiosity. For the families of the victims, it was the beginning of a quest for justice. For the media, it was a spectacle, a chance to uncover the full extent of the horrors Dahmer had committed. But for Dahmer himself, it was a reckoning, not only with the legal system, but with the darkest parts of his own psyche. Dahmer faced 15 counts of first-degree murder, each charge representing the life of a young man he had brutally taken. The evidence against him was overwhelming: photographs, human remains, and his own chilling confessions. But as the trial began, the question at the forefront of everyone's mind was not whether he had committed the crimes. Dahmer had already confessed in gruesome detail, but whether he could be held legally responsible for them. Dahmer's defense team argued that he was not legally sane at the time of the killings. They claimed he had suffered from severe psychological disorders, including necrophilia and borderline personality disorder, which rendered him unable to control his actions. Their goal was not to absolve Dahmer of guilt, but to have him declared legally insane, which would result in his being committed to a mental institution rather than serving a prison sentence. The prosecution, however, argued that Dahmer was fully aware of the nature and wrongfulness of his actions. They pointed to the calculated nature of his crimes, how he had lured his victims, drugged them, and methodically disposed of their bodies. Dahmer's ability to cover up his crimes, to evade detection for so long, showed that he knew exactly what he was doing. He was, they argued, not a man overcome by madness, but a cold-blooded killer who acted out of a need for control and domination. As the trial progressed, expert witnesses were called to testify about Dahmer's mental state. Psychiatrists for the defense described him as a man deeply disturbed by his compulsions, his need to possess and consume his victims both in life and death. They argued that Dahmer's inability to control these urges was evidence of a profound mental illness. But the prosecution's experts countered that while Dahmer's actions were undeniably horrific, he was not psychotic. He understood right from wrong and chose to act on his violent fantasies. In his own words, Dahmer explained that he had tried to stop himself from killing but found that the urges were too powerful. He claimed that he did not enjoy the act of killing itself, but was driven by an overwhelming desire to keep his victims with him forever. This desire, he said, led him to commit unspeakable acts. Acts he later admitted were selfish and evil. But despite his confessions, Dahmer's calm, detached demeanor left many wondering if he truly grasped the gravity of his crimes. For the families of the victims, his trial was an agonizing ordeal. Many had gone months, even years, without knowing what had happened to their loved ones. Now, they were forced to hear the gruesome details of their final moments. Some spoke in court, delivering powerful, heart-wrenching victim impact statements that revealed the depth of their pain. "I can't forgive you," one said through tears. "I will never forgive you for taking my son's life. You took him from us, and for what? So you wouldn't be alone?" Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder that behind each of Dahmer's victims was a family left shattered by his actions. After 2 weeks of testimony and nearly 5 hours of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. Jeffrey Dahmer was found legally sane and guilty on all 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, a total of 957 years without the possibility of parole. The court's decision made it clear. While Dahmer may have been deeply disturbed, he was fully responsible for the horrors he had committed. For Dahmer, the trial brought no closure. He had already admitted his guilt, knowing that his fate was sealed. Yet, in his final statement to the court, Dahmer expressed a kind of remorse, though whether it was genuine or another calculated act remains a matter of debate. "I know society will never be able to forgive me," he said. "I ask for no consideration. I deserve whatever I get because of what I have done." The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a public reckoning with the incomprehensible. It forced society to confront the fact that evil, in its most terrifying form, can hide in plain sight, masked by normalcy and politeness. But while Dahmer's conviction brought a sense of justice to his victims' families, the scars he left behind would never fully heal. In the end, Dahmer's trial was a moment of closure for many. But it also raised a profound question about the nature of insanity, responsibility, and the limits of human understanding. Was Dahmer truly in control of his actions? Or was he a man consumed by forces beyond his control? These are questions that may never be fully answered. In our next chapter, we will examine the aftermath of Dahmer's conviction, his time in prison, the public's reaction, and the tragic end to his life behind bars. But as we move forward, let us not forget the lessons of his trial, that justice, while necessary, cannot fully heal the wounds left by such unimaginable acts. Chapter 7. Public Reaction, Fear, and Fascination. With the conviction of Jeffrey Dahmer, the city of Milwaukee and the nation as a whole breathed a collective sigh of relief. The man responsible for so much terror had finally been brought to justice, and the scale of his crimes was no longer hidden in the shadows. But in the days, weeks, and months that followed, something curious happened. A mixture of fear, fascination, and anger spread across the public consciousness. For many, Dahmer was not just a criminal, but a symbol of something far darker lurking within society. The media played an enormous role in shaping how the world viewed Jeffrey Dahmer. News outlets, hungry for sensational stories, filled the airwaves and printed page with every grisly detail they could uncover. Nightly news broadcasts dissected his methods, his motivations, and his seemingly emotionless demeanor. True crime magazines ran extensive features on the Milwaukee Monster, turning his life and crimes into a macabre spectacle. Yet as disturbing as the details were, the public couldn't look away. Dahmer's crimes captured the morbid curiosity of millions, not just because of their brutality, but because of the questions they raised. How could such evil exist in someone so outwardly ordinary? How had he been able to commit these acts for so long without anyone noticing? For some, Dahmer was a monster, an aberration of humanity. For others, he was a chilling reminder that darkness can hide in plain sight. But even as the public demanded justice, there was another side to the reaction, an unsettling fascination with Dahmer himself. In the years following his conviction, Dahmer became the subject of countless books, documentaries, and even films. The public's hunger, pardon the pun, to understand the mind of a killer transformed Dahmer from a criminal into a cultural phenomenon, though one rooted in fear and morbid curiosity. True crime has always captured the public's imagination, but Dahmer's case struck a particularly deep nerve. His calm demeanor, combined with the grotesque nature of his crimes, made him a figure of endless fascination for psychologists, journalists, and the average person alike. The media framed him as an enigma, a man who defied easy explanations, whose monstrous acts could not be reconciled with his outwardly quiet and polite personality. Yet, This fascination raises troubling questions about our own relationship with violence and evil. Why do we feel compelled to understand, to dissect, to analyze the minds of men like Dahmer? Is it an attempt to protect ourselves from the unknown? To convince ourselves that such darkness can be explained and therefore avoided? Or is it something more primal? A need to confront the terrifying reality that such evil exists in the world? Regardless of the reasons, the public's reaction to Dahmer's crimes reveals much about the society in which he operated. His ability to commit these acts for so long, unnoticed and unchecked, speaks to the vulnerabilities that still exist in our systems of justice, mental health and community. And as the public wrestled with their fascination and fear, they were also forced to confront those uncomfortable truths. For the families of Dahmer's victims, the public's obsession with his crimes was often difficult to bear. While Dahmer became a figure of cultural fascination, their loved ones remained the true victims, young men whose lives were stolen far too soon. For them, there was no closure, no understanding, only grief and the knowledge that their sons, brothers and friends would never come home. In our next chapter, we will follow Jeffrey Dahmer into prison, where the final chapter of his life would unfold. But as we close this chapter, let us remember that behind every headline, every documentary and every book, there are real people. Victims whose stories deserve to be told with dignity and respect, and families whose pain can never be fully healed. Chapter 8. Life Behind Bars. The End of the Cannibal Killer. After his conviction in early 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer began his life sentence at the Columbia Correctional Institution. For the families of his victims, his incarceration marked the end of their pursuit of justice. But for Dahmer, it was the beginning of a new, darker chapter. One where the weight of his crimes would follow him until his final breath. Removed from society, Dahmer was now left to confront the reality of what he had done. Alone with his thoughts in a cell far removed from the horrors he once committed. At first, Dahmer's time in prison was largely uneventful. He was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection, as his notoriety made him a target for other inmates. But despite the isolation, Dahmer seemed to accept his fate. In fact, he appeared to welcome it. During interviews from behind bars, Dahmer expressed a kind of remorse, though whether it was genuine or another attempt to appear contrite is still a matter of debate. "I know what I did was wrong," Dahmer said in one of his final interviews. "I knew it was wrong when I did it, but I just couldn't stop. I deserved what I got." These words, spoken with a calm detachment, offered little solace to the families of his victims. For them, no amount of reflection or apology could erase the pain of losing their loved ones. Despite the grim circumstances of his imprisonment, Dahmer eventually requested to be removed from solitary confinement, preferring to live among the general prison population. He took on menial jobs within the prison, such as cleaning and mopping floors, and reportedly spent much of his time reading the Bible. Some reports even suggest that Dahmer had undergone a religious conversion, being baptized in prison in an attempt to seek redemption. For Dahmer, this newfound religious faith was, perhaps, an attempt to grapple with the enormity of his crimes. But for many, it was too little, too late. His sudden interest in salvation felt hollow, a final, desperate attempt to find meaning in a life defined by violence and death. But Jeffrey Dahmer's story would not end quietly. On the morning of November 28, 1994, just over 2 years after his conviction, Dahmer's life came to a brutal end. While performing his usual cleaning duties alongside 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver, Dahmer was attacked in a prison gymnasium. Scarver, a fellow inmate with a history of mental illness, beat Dahmer to death with a metal bar from a weight machine. The attack was swift and violent. Scarver later claimed that he had been disturbed by Dahmer's crimes and believed that Dahmer was unrepentant for what he had done. In a chilling twist of fate, a man who had inflicted so much pain and suffering on others met a violent end himself. dying on the cold floor of a prison gym at the age of 34. Scarver, who had also killed Jesse Anderson during the same attack, later told investigators that he felt a sense of justice in killing Dahmer. "I knew he was a murderer," Scarver said. "I couldn't stand what he had done, nor the way he carried himself in prison." Whether Scarver acted out of a personal sense of vengeance or in the throes of a mental illness remains unclear, but in the end, Jeffrey Dahmer's death was as violent as the crimes that had defined his life. For many, Dahmer's death was seen as a fitting conclusion to his story, a kind of poetic justice for a man who had caused so much pain. But for the families of his victims, it was a bitter reminder that closure in cases like these is often an illusion. While Dahmer may have been gone, the scars he left behind would remain for all their lifetimes. The death of Jeffrey Dahmer marked the end of a chapter in American crime history, but it also left behind a complicated legacy, one that continues to haunt the collective memory of those who lived through the horror of his crimes. His story is one of unimaginable evil, but also of a society grappling with how to understand and process such acts of violence. As we close this final chapter, we must ask ourselves what lessons can be learned from the life and death of Jeffrey Dahmer. His story is not just one of violence and madness, but of the fragility of the human condition. Dahmer's crimes force us to confront the darkest aspects of our nature, to acknowledge that evil can exist in the most unassuming of places. And yet, even as we search for meaning in his actions, we are left with more questions than answers. In the end, perhaps the greatest lesson we can take from Jeffrey Dahmer's life is that evil is not always something we can understand. It is, at times, irrational, incomprehensible, and devastating. But while we may never fully grasp the depths of Dahmer's depravity, we can strive to ensure that such horrors are never allowed to happen again. By remembering the victims, by learning from those failures that allowed Dahmer to evade justice for so long, we can honor those whose lives were tragically cut short. And so, we leave the story of Jeffrey Dahmer behind. But the lesson we have learned about evil, about humanity, and about justice remain with us. Let us carry them forward as we continue our exploration of history's darkest corners, always seeking to understand and always remembering the lives lost along the way. Thank you for joining us.